At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? I've got a really interesting guest for you today in Rosie Heydenrych, the owner of Turnstone Guitar, who makes exquisite classical guitars by hand. Her bespoke instruments have been exhibited at the prestigious Woodstock Guitar Show. She picked up a Guitar Magazine Gold Award in 2023, and for some years now, she has been pushing traditional boundaries when it comes to finding beautiful English timbers to use in place of globally declining tropical hardwoods. Rosie and I explore her early memories of the English countryside, the history of her craft, the challenges of sourcing truly sustainable timbers, and the power of good vibrations. Rosie, welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. Thanks so much for giving up your time to meet with me today at your workshop, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts about trees, timber, and your special craft. But my first question for you is, what do trees mean to you?
Trees, from my craft's perspective, it's everything. They mean a lot to me because they are the material that I have to understand to be able to build, to be able to manipulate the wood into becoming an instrument, and becoming a musical instrument at that. So they mean a lot as far as my experience and understanding of the actual properties of the material of wood. But from another level, trees, from a wider perspective, are among the natural world that I enjoy, that give me a sense of solace and something that I enjoy being around.
So tell me a bit more about those formative experiences with trees then. How far back does that relationship go for you?
Unknowingly, I guess, as a child playing in trees, lots of children play in trees and spend hours sat at the top of a tree. I guess that would probably be my earliest memories of a connection with trees. My father would often push us out to go for walks on the weekend, which I have to say, as when I was younger, I wasn't too keen. But I think that kind of laid quite a strong foundation for a love of the natural world and being within nature, specifically the English countryside. I have a really fond affinity to. I think there's nothing more beautiful than the English countryside, and I guess that comes from being around it from a young age.
Yeah, as a dad myself, I can definitely relate to that challenge of getting my girls outside and away from screens and other distractions. But undoubtedly, when they're there and in those places, they definitely find ways to entertain themselves. And we always come away from those walks as a family feeling really glad that we went to those places. Your workshop here is nestled in the Ashdown Forest in East Sussex. What does that landscape mean to you?
It's definitely inspiring to be in the Ashdown Forest, and we've enjoyed many walks and going to Winnie the Pooh Bridge, of all places. The trees here are absolutely beautiful, and I've walked it many times looking at trees thinking, I wonder what that tree, or usually being able to identify the species of tree, and then thinking about the wood that I use in my guitars and thinking, that could be like beech tree, what could I potentially use that for, or a cedar tree. I quite often will walk and just point at trees and try and identify what they are, but I'll also be looking at kind of the girth, for want of a better word, of the trunk, and like, oh, I could make a back out of that, or a neck. Not that I would want to tear down the tree. I obviously will respect it while it still wants to be alive in that in that setting. But I often think, oh, that's a really nice straight grain tree that would have some lovely western red cedar inside it, or something like that.
Have you got a favourite tree?
As in species of tree?
Could be either. So yeah, maybe one particular species really appeals to you, or yeah, perhaps it's an individual tree actually that you like to visit.
So that probably links to something that I'm recalling now, that I once got given a present where somebody planted a tree on my behalf, and I got to choose the species, and I chose oak. And we once went to visit this tree. I remember it was around the Shropshire area or somewhere, but I honestly, we've lost touch. We don't know. I don't know. The tree's probably there, but I have no idea where it is. But we did go and visit it once. So that was obviously my younger self. My favourite tree was an oak, because that's why I chose it. I think I could have chosen anything. So I probably, from a kind of what I enjoy looking at the most, would probably be that quintessential oak tree on a farmer's field in the distance. But yeah, I think now I couldn't really say, because there's so many woods that I love for the guitar building. But I probably would have to say maybe the oak from a historical perspective.
Typically, trees grow really well in Shropshire, so that oak you planted is probably quite sizable by now. Might be worth a visit at some point. And I'm wondering how early that kind of aesthetic appreciation for trees began, and what were the first things you maybe made from wood?
Well, I'd have to say what's coming to memory now is my school years, which was largely MDF based. It wasn't actually until I started doing this that I really started working proper wood. But at school I was making clocks and things like that, but as I say, it wasn't really proper woodwork, and the complexities that come with working with real wood, and that it was a living, breathing thing, and that it likes to misbehave a lot more than MDF does.
Before we dive into your current level of expertise with making guitars, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about the background of that wider craft that you're now part of.
Yeah, so there is, if you dig below the surface, there are quite a few of us in the Luthery hand-built guitar small shop world. The background is people have been making guitars since the 14th or 15th century. Well, the first guitars were probably lute-based, gut-stringed instruments, and then through the ages that's developed into classical guitars, into steel-string guitars, which is what I specialise in. And over the last 150 years, the mass production of instruments has begun, and that's a different thing in itself, but there still very much is kind of a niche world of hand builders, small shop builders, building, say, 10, 20, 30 guitars a year, all by individual makers or very small numbers of people building instruments.
So going that far back in time, people would have made these instruments purely by hand at first and worked on the design and the ergonomics over time, I guess, to refine to what we now understand as a classic guitar. Have you actually made one of these instruments purely by hand?
No is the answer, because as soon as what do you define as by hand? If you bring in any kind of tooling, i.e. a chisel, then that's an introduction of a tool, which fundamentally you say that's a hand tool, so you are making it by hand. But if you bring in something like a bandsaw, which is what you usually need to bring wood down from a larger form, then you say, well, actually, a hand tool is a saw. When I first started, I had a bandsaw, a pillar drill, and hand planes, chisels, nothing else major. And I built a whole guitar using just those tools. And I think that is the perfect way to introduce you to the craft, so that you learn the basis of the hand skills. But I would be lying if I told you that I haven't developed my tool repertoire to include routers, power saws, machine sanders, that do the grunt work for me, because after you've done it 5 times, you certainly appreciate what it takes to do things by hand. And as you suggest, starting to think like even everything by hand, you'd spend a long time making a guitar. And I think in the modern day setting, power tools do have their place, but you do definitely need to balance that with, you need the hand skills before you progress to the machines to understand fundamentally what you're doing and work at that slower pace. Because the thing about machines is they're great, but they can also destroy things very quickly as they make things.
I just want to take a minute to just chat through for our listeners the basic components. So perhaps we can help our listeners to visualize those different parts of a guitar.
So if you're imagining looking at somebody playing guitar, you are probably drawn to the main central body of the instrument. So the thing facing you is what's called the soundboard. And it's called the soundboard because effectively it's a board built to vibrate. So that's where the strings go into. It's braced to take the pull of the strings. And it has that characteristic of the rosette, which is basically a hole punched bang through the middle of it to project the sound out traditionally to an audience. Then facing the front as well, you're looking at what's known as the fretboard. Normally, it's your left hand, which is playing the frets, and that's how you dictate the notes, play chords, and where the strings run down. The headstock is the very bit at the top. That's where you'll have your tuner posts, where the strings wrap around, and that's how you bring the strings up to pitch. If you turn the instrument around, then you're looking at the back of the guitar, and the 2 pieces of wood that hold the back and the front together are known as the sides, also the ribs, and that's the curvature that the wood is bent, actually physically steam bent, to bring in that curvature of the shape of the guitar, creating the whole sound box. Essentially, you call it the sound box because the top being the driver, the box is kind of the reflector and the kind of bringing the character of the sound to life, but importantly, reflecting off the back and sending it out through the sound hole.
Great description. Thank you. What's the longest you've ever spent making a single instrument?
The longest was my very first, but there were instruments that didn't make it before that one. So actually the period, I think, from when I first started venturing into guitar making to when I finished a guitar, I'm pretty sure was about 4 years. So it was a long time. I turned our spare room into a workshop when I first started and started building a ukulele. And that's the other thing to say is ukulele is small. So the fundamentals of the design are very similar, but simplified and scaled down. So if you don't have much room, something like a ukulele and the book you can buy on how to build a ukulele is a nice, fairly cheap and non-committed way of testing the waters to see if it's something that interests you. The ukulele, I never made it. I made the neck and I made the body, and I just freaked out. I didn't know how to attach the two together. So I did an evening course, and that's where I first started. That one I stopped because I took on an internship where my mentor at the time basically said, start again, because we'll start from scratch and do it to a higher quality. You see these courses where people build a guitar in 3 months. I just couldn't understand. I was like, how are these people doing it? And what's actually happening is a lot of it is that you're kind of putting components together, but you're not understanding the fundamentals, kind of the lower level basis. So it took 2 years from that start of building that guitar to get to a finished result. And that is the first one that I still keep with me to this day. But when I finished it, it was kind of an unbelievable feeling because I'd waited 4 years to actually get to that stage. But it made you want to then move on to the next one.
Have you still got that first guitar?
Yes, I do. Yeah. At home. Still together.
What was that one made of?
That was Indian rosewood spruce. So quite a traditional classic, which is, again, a good way. You have to kind of start with the traditional materials.
And you've since moved on to working with indigenous hardwoods, haven't you, as well?
Yeah, so how I came to being interested in English woods was in the guitar building world, there's lots of talk about kind of the future of the availability of woods, and a lot of the traditional Dalbergia species were used for the back and sides, spruce for the top, mahogany for the neck, but most importantly the rosewoods, the pinnacle being Brazilian rosewood, is now on CITES Appendix 1. You can no longer obtain it unless for obscene prices. So even when I was first training, the talk was about, well, what are you going to do in the future? I can't even really obtain that now, let alone in 20, 30 years' time when hopefully I'll still be building guitars. So it was already kind of seeded in my mind, what am I going to do? So that's kind of background. And then it came to my attention that for a back and side wood, which is the ribs and the back of the guitar, it's often made of a hardwood, kind of that's what gives the guitar its character. I came across an English walnut back and side set. And I was like, okay, well, that's interesting. It's used quite widely, so it's not like I was I was out there, it is used quite widely, and it's good for purpose. So that got my interest. It's like, well, okay, we've got English wood that is suitable. What potentially could be used for other parts of the guitar? And that's what sent me down the rabbit hole of finding soundboards, binding, necks, braces, discovering through traditional woods what makes those suitable for certain parts of the guitar, and replicating that in English wood, which I have found.
So actually, in the end, the species that you used to go for walks amongst, you've ended up making beautiful instruments from.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to see that you can actually replicate it. So for the backs and sides, I really like English cherry, English walnut, English grown black walnut, particularly nice. Sycamore, which guitars for a long time have been built from maple back and sides. So that one is kind of towing the line between a relatively traditional wood, but English grown sycamore, I'm sure, I haven't used maple, but I'm sure English grown maple may be suitable as well. London plane, that falls into that Acer kind of category. Bog oak, ancient fenland oak, which is 5,000-year-old oak in the fens. That takes on a greater density and is even more suitable for the back and sides. For the soundboard, I started by using Western red cedar, which again, it's used traditionally in instruments. So the logic was, well, if it's used in traditional instruments, let's try and use it in an English variety. And drilling down even further into that, then a lot of the wood, how it grows in certain countries. So you often get your Western red cedar from North America because the trees, they grow very slowly. The grain lines are very thin. But however, in England, they grow a little bit faster. So the grain lines are a little bit more splayed. So visually, it looks a bit different. The question is it strong enough? Because the grain lines give the wood a lot of strength. So that was for me to kind of investigate, and I've subsequently gone and used it tonally. I'm happy with it. And then it all kind of develops from there. English yew is something that I came across actually using it as a back and side first, because it's species-wise is a softwood, but it's actually quite hard. And I use it as a back and sides because, again, exploring my supplier's wood stash, he had some sets. And I was like, is this suitable? He says, yeah, lots of people have used yew as back and sides. But then came the question of, well, can I use it for a soundboard? Because you come across woods that are all hardwood, so like all mahogany guitars. So hardwoods have been used for top. So it was kind of then, all right, let's take a gamble. Well, not a gamble, because I came across another maker at a guitar show who had built a guitar using English yew, an English maker called Gary Southwell. So I asked him, I saw him at the show, I said, how did you find it? He absolutely super. So that was kind of like the push that then led me to take the gamble to use it on the soundboard. Then I came across Cedar of Lebanon, which is a similar kind of thing. It's obviously a cedar, but it's harder. So that was almost like the mix between cedar and yew. So that was me kind of like starting to use my experience and expertise to make considered judgments on where I could potentially go next. And the neck, that needs to be strong because that's supporting the pull of the strings. So traditionally it's mahogany, and then you can kind of venture into things like walnut, sycamore, cherry.
Is it okay if we perhaps hear some different woods and how they sound in guitars that you've made?
Yeah, absolutely.
So as you're talking us through these, if you could perhaps play out the sound and then describe what it is you're appreciating or listening for in the quality of that sound, and why did you make the guitar like it is to produce that? And I think it's fair to say that probably every tree, depending on how it's grown, might bring a different sound, right? So they can all be individual.
And the bracing and the neck, there's so many different variables. Okay, so this guitar is what I call an E-series guitar, so every single part of it, barring the strings, the frets, and the tuners, are all made out of English wood. Every wooden part of this guitar is English. The back and sides has English grown black walnut, and I think it was actually, now I'm saying it, it was a special piece of black walnut from Kew, which was a tree planted by Queen Victoria. Really, really nice bit of black walnut, and that was teamed with a cedar of Lebanon, English grown cedar of Lebanon soundboard and English sycamore neck. Walnut brings a nice rounded warmth to it, and cedar of Lebanon is slightly harder, so it brings a slight sweeter note than, say, something softer like western red cedar. Sycamore as well of the neck, having a slightly a sweeter attack. So all of these things combine together to kind of produce an overall tone. Overarchingly, this is kind of like a nice warm, rounded guitar. What I try to achieve with all of my guitars is to have a balance, so it has a really nice kind of warm bass, but it should also, through the slightly harder properties of the cedar of Lebanon, still have a really nice sweetness to it and not kind of just get lost in warmthy haze. It needs to kind of attack as well. And I think the cedar of Lebanon and the slightly harder neck, being sycamore, help to deliver that.
Really interesting. Perhaps you can fire up another one for us and talk us through that.
Yeah. This guitar is the other end of the spectrum as far as woods are concerned, being very traditional woods. We have Indian rosewood on the back and sides and a alpine spruce soundboard, mahogany neck. This is a smaller model, be a little bit more punchy, so the smaller instruments tend to respond quicker and punch out volume faster because there's less time wasted trying to excite a soundboard. The aim with my small body instruments is still to not lose kind of the bass, so I build them a little bit deeper. And this example, as you can see with the rosewood and the spruce, you get what's called overtones, which is kind of when the frequencies excite each other, and this kind of the bloom of the note you hear. And I think that comes through with this particular instrument. And the spruce as well, a traditional wood, it's used for a reason. It has really nice sweet attack. It can take a little while to warm up. Well, a lot of woods in guitars can, because they're not used to being guitars. You know, frequencies going through them over many years, they start to kind of develop. People will say guitars open up. As guitars are played, they kind of bed in and open up. The sound loosens. The wood kind of relaxes into itself because it's under a lot of forces. So it takes sometimes, I think, a guitar to know really what's going on and kind of roll with it, really. So
fascinating. How long do you think that normally takes?
it depends how much it's played. So when I build an instrument, I obviously will play it to make sure all the frets, everything works as it should. But I often find that once people really start playing, if I give it to a professional player for a week, or the person who has commissioned it takes it home, they'll often say, because they're playing it, they're always excited about it and they want to play it a lot, that period is exponential how it opens up. You can actually get a vibrator for a guitar to pretend to mimic. You can just leave it kind of vibrating on the bridge, and that's for that same thing, that you can kind of just leave it continually vibrating overnight for, say, 3 days, and they theorize that the guitar will sound different after those 3 days. There's a massive vintage market. The pre-war Martins go for ridiculous sums of money. They sound incredible. Martin can't seem to replicate it. No, and that's no diss on the Martin Guitar Company, but even they say, could it be the time that it's, for the ones that have survived, have just been played so much, they've taken on a life in themselves because they've just been played for 100 years.
And why is sourcing your timber sustainably so important to you?
It is important to me, but there is an element of it when you delve deeper that it becomes a little bit more complicated for numerous reasons. Some of the wood that I buy is FSC, which is certified as sustainable. That's absolutely fine. And that in any way possible, that would be my preference. A lot of the English wood that I use has come from felled trees, so that's great as well, but it's not sustainable. The other wood that I use is not sustainable, and I have to kind of be analytical of that, but it also becomes slightly complicated. So as I was saying earlier, with the use of traditional woods, a lot of the stocks are depleting, and there is a certain market driver that drives what people want in instruments, and to a certain degree we have to utilize wood that the market wants. So in the guitar world, it's a really interesting discussion as to what builds an incredible instrument. It's quite easy to say that something like a Dalbergia species, Brazilian rosewood, as it was so plentiful in the past, builds a beautiful guitar, and often it does. But there's a lot more elements to a guitar that build beautiful tone that people don't understand nearly as much. And it's up to us as the guitar makers and the luthiers to show this, both through using different wood, because often people don't get the opportunity to use different wood, because if they can't sell the instrument at the end of the day, they don't make them. And that's kind of the balance that a lot of younger generation luthiers are trying to negotiate, that the market is asking for Dalbergia species, the dealers are asking for Dalbergia species because they know that that's what people want, because they've been talking about it for the past 50 years, that it builds a great guitar. But equally showing through example and taking a risk on other woods to show, actually, no, they may be different, but they're equally as inspiring and beautiful, both visually and tonally. So there's a really interesting argument to be had there. But then equally, the rosewoods are an interesting discussion to go into further, because you can say, well, they are dying out and we need to use alternative woods, and blanket say, stop using rosewoods. But the interesting point on the other side of that is that if we completely stop using the rosewood, it's a death wish for them in the end anyway, because if there's no market value for this wood to be grown, people won't grow it. So either way, it's kind of like you feel between a rock and a hard place, because you feel you shouldn't use the wood because it's been over-harvested and it's on the CITES lists and driving a market that potentially shouldn't be there. But then it's like, well, is there actually a place for this in the high-end acoustic world, which we do move in, to actually still promote these woods and give the plantation farmers the monetary value that these extremely rare woods and beautiful woods deserve? If we stop using all of the tropical woods and we say, no, we're not using them anymore, they'll die. They'll go anyway, because there's no point in these people cultivating these precious woods because there's no financial gain.
It sounds like a really challenging scenario. As someone that's gone deep into trees and woodland management, I know that it's impossible to avoid thinking about these things all the time, and actually guitars are a really common instrument. So you must hear guitars in popular music, etc. Tell us a little bit about that experience. How do guitars and the sounds of them feature in your daily life?
Music's always been a massive part of my life, and guitars was an extension of that, and finding an instrument that resonates with me. It's the instrument that I've fallen in love with and what enabled me to create music, but also enables countless other people. I enjoy watching them play. I enjoy what the guitar enables people to do creatively. So I always appreciate that whenever I see any artist play live and use it as a tool for creation. As a builder, that obviously then takes on a different element of analysis. When you see people playing guitars, you're like, what are they playing? What is it about the instrument maybe that they chose it? From a luthier perspective, you're interested into what drew the artist to that guitar, be it through personal choice or even these days endorsements. And creatively what people are doing with the instrument. So music goes through trends. When I was growing up, it was very much kind of a singer-songwriter, and it goes round in fits and starts. But, the guitar is a cultural phenomenon. I don't think it will ever be replaced. It goes through ebbs and flows of popularity, which is also interesting to watch, but it's also interesting to see what people do with it. And usually it takes on a new life when somebody does something incredibly new with it. So there's always that potential for somebody to come and blow the water apart with something new that they're doing with the instrument, and that's always exciting to see. But for me, it's an instrument that I love, and through all its contributions to popular culture and society, it's a pleasure for me to be involved in creating something like that.
If I could give you a time machine and we could go to visit anyone in history that might have played the guitar, and they get to play one of your guitars right now, who would that be?
Eva Cassidy.
And why?
Because she's an awesome guitar player, beautiful singer, and probably, as far as kind of that classic acoustic guitar player, singer, she was an incredible guitar player and her voice was phenomenal. So I would happily sit in a room if she wanted to play my guitars.
Thanks, Rosie. I'll see what I can do. And for our last question, I'm going to bring things back to trees, and I'd like you to leave our listeners with one final message. So what would that be?
Trees sound awesome.
You've been listening to the Meaning of Trees podcast. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And see you next time.